Good morning again, everyone. Let me ask you a question. What are the criteria that you look for when pursuing a relationship with somebody else? What do you look for in a friend, a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or even a potential spouse? Well, that's really the question for today's devotion. And it's going to cover the second aspect of Isaac's life, which are the selection criteria of a wife for Isaac. We spent our first devotion looking at personal preparation and how God was preparing Isaac to be the leader, to be the husband that he would need him to be in his household. And having been prepared, he's now ready. He's ready to lead. He's ready to be a husband for Rebekah and to lead in that relationship. And we saw how God is preparing each one of us for a role in this life and a role ultimately in the kingdom, and how we need to take advantage of the time that we have for personal preparation. But what we'd like to talk about today is what should we be looking for when we think about relationships? Well, in the life of Isaac at this point, when we come to Genesis chapter 24, Sarah had just recently died. Sarah was Isaac's mother, as you know. And Abraham, we're told in Genesis 24 and verse 1, was old and well stricken in years. And perhaps with Abraham thinking about his mortality and the death of his wife, he realized he really needed to do something about getting Isaac a wife. Isaac was now 40 years old. He was the child of promise. Yet despite that fact, he didn't have a wife. Abraham was told that he would have as many children as the stars in the sky. But how would you have all those children when the child of promise isn't married? So you can see the challenge that's presented here. So Abraham calls his most trusted servant Eliezer, and he gives him a specific commission. He tells him, you need to go and look for a wife for my son Isaac. But he gives him one very important criteria, a non-negotiable criteria. He says in verse 3, thou shalt not take a wife unto my son of the daughters of the Canaanites. There was no negotiating on this part. She could not be a woman of the world. She needed to be a woman of the household of faith. He was unwilling to compromise on that point. And beyond that, he says in verse 6 that Abraham says in verse 6 that he needed Isaac to be able to live in the land of promise, to live in a place where he could worship God. He says in verse 6, beware that thou bring not my son thither again. Do not take him back to a former way of life. In verse 8 again, he says, only bring not my son thither again. And so the first criteria is that this wife, whoever she was, had to worship God correctly. She had to be of the household of faith, a member of the ecclesia. And beyond that, he needed Isaac to live in a place where he could be an active member of the ecclesia. So that has to be the top requirement for us young people. When we are looking for friendships, when we are looking for relationships, that we need to place at the forefront a commonality in purpose, that we need to pursue relationships with those who are of the household of faith. And when we're looking for a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a spouse, that's not negotiable. It has to be the top priority. And when making a decision on where we're going to live, we have to make the decision to be somewhere where we can be an active member of God's household. So, this was the requirement that was given to Eliezer. And now Eliezer has the difficult task of going up to the north to find a wife for Isaac. And Eliezer is a bit concerned about the prospects of his success. He says to Abraham, well, what if she's not willing to come with me? And that's the big question of the chapter. Would this woman be willing to come to join the household of faith? Abraham tells Eliezer that he's confident that God's going to provide a wife, but if the woman doesn't want to come, then Eliezer would be free from the oath. So Eliezer sets off to the north, 10 camels, a number of servants with him, a lot of dowry, to try to convince whoever this is that she should come down. Somebody from the household of Abraham is who he was looking for. And so, with that criteria in mind, he begins the search. But where does he go from there? And where should we go from there once we've established that the person needs to be of the household of faith? Well, note the pattern that Eliezer follows. First, he prays to God in verses 12 to 14. He asks for God's guidance in everything. Then he looks for a woman who's willing to serve, as we saw in verse 14, because he said that whoever it was that he asked, she needed to be willing to give him water. And not just him, but she needed to be willing to go the extra mile and give water to all of his camels. So she had to be joyful in her service. She also had to be pure. In verse 16, when he sees Rebekah, he notes that she is a virgin, that she's separated herself to God and kept herself pure from the rest of the world around her. She's purposeful and enthusiastic in her service. We're told in verse 18 that she made haste, and in verse 20 that she ran, and she did the job fully. Not half-hearted, but she finished the job. We're told in verse 19 that she kept watering the camels until they were done drinking. And we can kind of read over that quickly and good job, finished it completely. But have you ever looked into how much a camel can drink? I did a little bit of researching because I was interested. How much can a thirsty camel drink? And it wasn't just one thirsty camel. It was 10 thirsty camels. And you know what I found? That a thirsty camel can drink between 30 and 50 gallons of water. So if you were to multiply this by 10 camels, that would be 500 gallons of water, or 1,893 liters of water. That's a lot of water that she would have had to draw. A lot of water. 1,800 kilograms worth of water, in fact. That could have taken easily an hour to do all that work. Completely, willingly, and joyfully. Pretty amazing woman when you think about it. And not only that, but she was given to hospitality. We found that she offered their house as a place for him to stay in verse 25. And Eliezer, when he talked to the family, he sought the approval of the family. He wanted to make sure that the family supported the relationship because he realized that this was a joining together of two families. And Rebekah, just like Isaac, respected her parents. We find that she waited for her turn to speak. She listened to what the elders of the house had to say, and she spoke and gave her opinion when asked, similar to how Isaac was in obedience to his father. And when Eliezer sees that his prayer has been answered, he makes thanks to God in verse 26 and in verse 52. And we find that he's willing to submit his personal will to the will of God. Eliezer does that, and Rebekah does that. Rebekah says in verse 58, when asked, "Will you go with this man?" she says, "I will go." Resolutely, she determines that she will go and join the household of faith. And in so doing, she answers the big question of the chapter. What if this woman won't go? She says, "I will go. I'm willing to join the household of faith." So what can we learn from this? Well, let's make sure that we only pursue those relationships with those who love God. To find others who love God, who want to be a part of his ecclesia, and build friendships, build relationships, look for spouses that first love God. And how do we do this? The same way that Eliezer did, praying for guidance, looking for those who are willing to serve and willing to do it joyfully, finding people who are given to hospitality, those who respect their parents, because if they respect their parents, they're going to be a lot more likely to respect God and to be helpful to us in our relationship. Get to know their family. Seek their support. Wait until that person has first made a commitment to God before they make a commitment to you. And remember to always give thanks to God whenever you see Him working in your life. It's vitally important that we apply these same criteria to our search, in our relationships, and in our search for a husband or a wife, to make sure that we're setting ourselves up for success. And not only do we need to look for these things in others, but we need to strive to develop these things in ourselves, to develop that spirit of Rebekah that we see in willing service and in obedience and a desire to join the household of faith. It can be challenging to remember these criteria when emotions are high. But if we go into our search knowing what it is that we're looking for, praying for God's guidance, then we can be confident that He'll give us what we need to help us toward the kingdom.